Los Angeles International Airport buzzed with the energy of thousands of travelers. Businesspeople in crisp suits rushed to their gates, families herded their children toward security checkpoints, and the intercom droned overhead with final boarding calls. The first-class check-in line was an island of quiet luxury in the midst of the chaos. Soft leather luggage, designer handbags, and tailored suits filled the space, an unspoken testament to wealth and privilege. Among the well-dressed passengers stood a man who seemed oddly out of place. He wore a worn plaid shirt, faded jeans, and scuffed boots. His black backpack, faded and well-traveled, was slung over one shoulder. There was nothing about him that screamed luxury, and yet, he stood calmly in line, his presence understated but undeniable. Keanu Reeves. He glanced around, observing the hurried faces around him. The contrast between him and the others in the line was stark, but Keanu didn't seem to mind. He was used to moving through the world unnoticed when he could, preferring quiet observation over unnecessary attention. A few places behind him, Carl Harding was growing impatient. Carl, a man in his late 40s, was the embodiment of corporate success. His navy blue suit was pressed to perfection, his shoes shone like polished glass, and his cologne carried a scent so distinct it left a lingering trail. He adjusted his gold cufflinks as he surveyed the line, a hint of irritation flashing across his sharp features. His eyes landed on Keanu, and his expression darkened. What's this guy doing in first class? Carl had spent decades clawing his way to the top of the financial world, building an empire from nothing. To him, first class wasn't just about comfort, it was a symbol of power, of success. And this man, this casually dressed nobody, didn't belong here. Carl leaned slightly to the side, catching the attention of a fellow businessman in the line. First class really isn't what it used to be, he muttered with a smirk. His companion chuckled politely but said nothing. Keanu, standing just a few feet away, heard the comment but didn't react. Instead, he stepped forward as the line moved, handing over his passport with a polite nod. The agent at the counter smiled, scanning his details without hesitation. Carl watched, still perplexed. Maybe he won some kind of contest. A last-minute upgrade? The idea amused him. Whatever it is, he won't be getting in my way. Minutes later, the first-class passengers were called for boarding. Carl walked briskly toward the gate, his leather briefcase in hand. He wanted to be among the first to board, to settle in before the lesser passengers clogged up the aisles. As he stepped onto the jet bridge, he allowed himself a moment of satisfaction. The smooth process of first-class boarding was one of the privileges he enjoyed most. No waiting, no struggling for overhead space, no rubbing elbows with the masses. Just pure, uninterrupted luxury. When he reached his row, Carl set his briefcase down, preparing to take his seat. Then he saw something that made him stop mid-motion. The casually dressed man from the check-in line, Keanu Reeves, was settling into the seat right next to his. Carl blinked, his expression shifting from mild annoyance to disbelief. "You've got to be kidding me." Keanu glanced up, meeting Carl's eyes with a calm, polite expression. He gave a small nod. "Looks like we're seatmates." Carl exhaled through his nose, forcing a smile that barely concealed his irritation. Out of all the seats on this plane. He dropped into his seat with a slight huff, already regretting this flight. Keanu, however, simply leaned back, completely unbothered. He had no idea just how much Carl's assumptions would be challenged before they reached their destination. The plane hummed with the quiet efficiency of a well-oiled machine as first-class passengers settled into their wide leather seats. Soft overhead lighting bathed the cabin in a golden glow, and the scent of fresh coffee and citrus lingered in the air. The flight attendants moved with practiced elegance, offering pre-flight beverages and warm towels. Carl Harding, however, was far from relaxed. He shifted in his seat, stealing another glance at the man beside him, still dressed like he had wandered into first class by mistake. Keanu sat comfortably, one leg crossed over the other, a faint air of ease about him. He didn't fidget with his seatbelt or glance impatiently at his watch like the other businessmen around them. Instead, he simply existed, calm, present, and undisturbed. That alone annoyed Carl. Carl had spent years perfecting the art of exuding status. His world was one of polished appearances, firm handshakes, and the silent but obvious display of power. He could tell a man's worth by his watch, the cut of his suit, and the confidence in his step. And this guy had none of it. The flight attendant approached, her red lips curving into a professional smile. "Would you care for a drink before takeoff?" Carl barely let her finish before speaking. "Scotch." "Neat." She nodded, then turned to Keanu. "And for you, sir?" Keanu glanced up and gave a small smile. "Just water, please." Carl let out a quiet chuckle, shaking his head slightly as the attendant moved away. He turned to Keanu, his voice carrying just enough amusement to make it clear he wasn't asking a real question. "Water? Really?" Keanu met his gaze, unaffected. "Yeah. It's good for you." Carl smirked. "Sure, if you're sitting in coach. But up here, we enjoy the finer things." Keanu took the glass of water the attendant placed in front of him, holding it up slightly. "I think this is just fine." Carl scoffed, swirling his scotch. "I guess everyone has different standards." He took a slow sip, watching for any reaction. Keanu, however, had already turned back to his window, seemingly uninterested in whatever game Carl was playing. Carl leaned back, adjusting his expensive cufflinks, then let out an exaggerated sigh. "You know," he began, his tone casual but laced with condescension, "first class isn't what it used to be. Used to be you could tell who belonged here." Keanu glanced at him, raising an eyebrow but saying nothing. Carl tilted his head slightly. "What do you do, anyway?" Keanu reached down, adjusting the strap on his well-worn backpack. "I work in film." Carl's smirk widened. "Film, huh? Commercials? Indie projects?" He took another sip of his drink. "Or are you one of those struggling actors trying to make it big?" Keanu smiled slightly. "Something like that." Carl chuckled. "Yeah, I figured. Hollywood's tough, huh? I know a few people in the business. Cutthroat world. Not really the kind of place where you end up flying first class, unless, of course, you got lucky." Keanu tilted his head slightly, considering the words. He took a sip of water, then placed the glass back on the tray table. "Luck's a funny thing," he said finally. "It means different things to different people." Carl scoffed. Sure. But let's be real. Some people work their way up here, people like me. And others," he gestured vaguely toward Keanu, as if that explained everything. "Well, they just happen to find themselves in the right place at the right time." Keanu turned slightly to face him, his expression thoughtful rather than offended. "And which one do you think you are?" Carl frowned, caught off guard by the question. "Me? Oh, I earned everything I have." He gestured around the luxurious cabin. "Every single bit of it. No handouts, no lucky breaks. Just hard work." Keanu nodded slowly. "That's admirable." Carl blinked, momentarily thrown off by the sincerity in Keanu's voice. He had been expecting an argument, maybe even an attempt at self-justification. But this calm acceptance, this unshakable composure, it was frustrating. Carl shifted, crossing his arms. "Yeah, well, not everyone understands what it takes to get here." Keanu gave a small nod. "You're probably right." Carl exhaled sharply. "You know, you're an interesting guy." Keanu chuckled lightly. "I get that a lot." Carl studied him for a moment, searching for something, anything, that would crack the mystery of the man beside him. But Keanu's face gave nothing away. The flight attendants moved through the cabin, preparing for takeoff. As the engines rumbled to life, Carl decided to push a little further. "You seem awfully comfortable here," he said. Keanu turned back toward him. "Should I not be?" Carl let out a short laugh. "I mean, look at you. You don't exactly scream first-class material." Keanu considered the statement for a moment. Then he simply smiled. "Maybe first-class material isn't just about how you look." Carl opened his mouth to respond, but something about the way Keanu said it stopped him. It wasn't defensive. It wasn't challenging. It was just, true. For the first time since boarding, Carl hesitated. The seatbelt sign dinged, signaling takeoff. Keanu leaned back, closing his eyes as the plane began its ascent. Carl, however, remained restless. He had assumed this conversation would be easy, that he would establish dominance, as he always did. Instead, Keanu had met every comment with an almost infuriating level of grace. Carl didn't like it. He wasn't used to losing. And though he wouldn't admit it yet, part of him was beginning to wonder if maybe, just maybe, he had already lost. The plane leveled out at cruising altitude, and the soft chime of the seatbelt sign turning off signaled the start of in-flight service. A flight attendant glided through first class, offering warm towels and menus for the evening meal. The scent of freshly brewed coffee and buttered rolls drifted through the cabin. Carl Harding, however, barely noticed. He was too focused on the man beside him, the enigma wrapped in worn-out jeans and an old plaid shirt. Keanu Reeves. Not that Carl knew that yet. To him, the man in seat 2A was just a nobody. A guy who didn't belong in first class. Carl had spent years surrounded by power. He was used to commanding respect with a glance, making people shift in their seats with a well-timed smirk. But this guy? He didn't react the way Carl expected. He didn't shrink under scrutiny, didn't defend himself, didn't even seem fazed by the implied insults. That alone irritated Carl more than he wanted to admit. The flight attendant approached with a polished smile. "Have you decided on your dinner, sir?" Carl barely glanced at the menu. "The filet mignon. Medium rare." "And for you, sir?" she asked, turning to Keanu. Keanu smiled up at her. "Just the pasta, please." Carl scoffed before he could stop himself. "Of course." Keanu glanced at him. "Something wrong?" Carl smirked, swirling the last of his scotch in his glass. "Nothing. It's just, interesting." Keanu tilted his head slightly. "What is?" Carl shrugged. "You're sitting in first class, but you act like you're in economy." Keanu smiled, the corners of his eyes crinkling slightly. "And how exactly is first class supposed to act?" Carl chuckled, setting his glass down. "Come on. You know what I mean. This isn't just about legroom or a better meal. It's a status thing. A statement. People up here," he gestured toward the other passengers, many of whom were engaged in hushed conversations over glasses of champagne, "they're here because they earned it. They worked for it." Keanu nodded. "I see." Carl leaned back, adjusting his expensive watch so it caught the light. "I mean, no offense, but you don't exactly look like someone who belongs here." Keanu simply took a sip of his water. "And what does someone who belongs here look like?" Carl smirked. "Well, for starters, they usually don't order pasta." A few seats away, a woman raised an eyebrow, clearly eavesdropping on the conversation. Another passenger, a man in his early 30s wearing an expensive watch, glanced over with mild interest. Keanu chuckled, shaking his head. "I didn't realize the meal choice was part of the membership requirement." Carl grinned, sensing an opportunity to regain control of the conversation. "It's not about the meal. It's about mindset. People like me, we built something. We fought our way to the top. We belong up here." Keanu nodded slowly, considering his words. So, because you have money, that means you deserve better treatment than others? Carl let out a short laugh. It's not about better treatment. It's about reality. The world isn't fair, my friend. Some people climb, and some people stay at the bottom. It's just how things are. Keanu took another sip of water before responding. That's an interesting perspective. Carl raised an eyebrow. What, you don't agree? Keanu thought for a moment, then smiled. I think people show who they really are by how they treat others. Especially when they think no one's watching. Carl let out a slow exhale through his nose. The passengers nearby were now subtly tuned in, some pretending to be lost in their books or screens while clearly listening. Carl smirked, deciding to press further. You know what I think? I think people who talk about humility and kindness are usually the ones who've never had real power. Keanu gave him a thoughtful look. And what do you think real power is? Carl grinned, finally feeling like he had the upper hand. Influence. Money. Status. He gestured around the luxurious cabin. Being able to shape the world around you. Keanu nodded slowly. And yet, here we are. Sitting in the same seat, flying the same flight, eating the same meal. Carl's smirk faltered slightly. Keanu continued, his voice calm. For all the money and power in the world, we're still just two people on a plane. And when we land, we'll both step out onto the same ground. A quiet murmur rippled through the nearby seats. A businessman across the aisle lowered his newspaper slightly, revealing a small, knowing smile. The woman who had been eavesdropping glanced at Keanu with recognition, her eyes widening slightly. Carl, however, wasn't ready to back down. That's cute. Really? But you're missing the point. Keanu raised an eyebrow. Am I? Carl leaned in slightly, lowering his voice. People respect money. They respect power. That's just how the world works. You can be as humble as you want, but at the end of the day, respect isn't given, it's earned. Keanu smiled, tilting his head. I agree. Carl blinked. Wait, you do? Keanu nodded. Respect is earned. But not by how much money you have. Carl narrowed his eyes. Then how? Keanu's voice remained steady. By how you treat people. By how you carry yourself when no one's watching. By the way you make others feel. Carl let out a short laugh, shaking his head. That's idealistic nonsense. Keanu shrugged. Maybe. Or maybe real power isn't about making yourself bigger, it's about lifting others up. The woman across the aisle let out a quiet chuckle, shaking her head as she looked toward Carl. You might want to Google who you're talking to, she murmured just loud enough for him to hear. Carl frowned, her words not fully registering. He turned back to Keanu, who simply gave him a small, knowing smile before glancing out the window. The tension in the cabin had shifted. The smug certainty Carl had carried onto the plane was starting to crack. For the first time in a long time, he felt like the one on the back foot. And the worst part? He didn't understand why. Carl took a slow sip of his scotch, rolling the expensive liquid over his tongue. He was still trying to regain control of the conversation, but something about the way the man next to him, Keanu, or whatever his name was, handled himself made it impossible. He wasn't defensive, wasn't trying to prove anything. That irritated Carl more than he cared to admit. The flight attendant returned with a practiced smile. Mr. Reeves, the captain wanted me to inform you that your connection in Tokyo has been confirmed. Carl's scotch nearly went down the wrong pipe. He coughed, blinking rapidly. Reeves? The flight attendant continued, oblivious to Carl's expression. Also, the cabin crew would like to extend their regards. If you need anything at all during the flight, please don't hesitate to ask. Keanu gave her a warm, appreciative smile. Thank you. That's very kind. The moment stretched, the air in first class shifting. A soft murmur rippled through the surrounding passengers. A businessman across the aisle suddenly sat up straighter, lowering his newspaper with wide eyes. The woman who had been eavesdropping let out a quiet, "Oh my God." Carl, however, was frozen in place. His mind scrambled, piecing together every detail from their conversation. The worn-out jeans, the simple demeanor, the maddeningly unshakable calm. And now the name. Keanu Reeves. As in the Keanu Reeves. Carl's face drained of color. He glanced around, noticing the subtle shift in the cabin's energy. A few passengers were now openly looking at him, some with mild amusement, others with quiet judgment. The businessman who had been listening leaned toward Carl slightly and murmured, "You just spent the last hour lecturing Keanu Reeves about success and status. That's impressive." Carl barely heard him. His ears buzzed, his heartbeat hammering in his chest. Keanu turned toward him, his expression still kind, still composed, as if nothing had changed. But to Carl, everything had changed. Carl started, but the words didn't come. Keanu tilted his head slightly. "Something wrong, Carl?" Carl's mouth opened, then closed. His mind replayed every smug remark, every condescending comment. He had mocked this man, subtly tried to make him feel small, and all along, he had been speaking to one of the most beloved and respected actors in the world. And worse? Keanu had handled it with more grace than Carl had ever seen in another human being. Carl let out a quiet, disbelieving laugh, rubbing a hand over his face. You could have said something." Keanu shrugged lightly. "You didn't ask." Carl stared at him, incredulous. That calm, patient demeanor, it wasn't an act. It wasn't some calculated move to humiliate him. Keanu had let Carl dig his own hole, not out of malice, but simply because he had no need to prove anything. Carl had spent years believing that power and wealth demanded respect. That status meant everything. But in the last hour, he had been outclassed, not by money, not by business acumen, but by something far rarer. Authenticity. A few rows back, a younger man whispered excitedly to his seatmate. "Dude, that's Keanu Reeves." The woman who had been listening leaned slightly toward Carl and added with a smirk, "Bet you feel pretty stupid right now." Carl did. The worst part was that no one was openly mocking him. No one was rubbing his failure in his face. The humiliation came from within, from the realization that he had exposed himself. And Keanu? He was still just sitting there, sipping his water, perfectly content. Carl exhaled, shaking his head. I think I owe you an apology." Keanu looked at him, his expression open, but he didn't say anything. He just waited. Carl swallowed, the weight of his own words pressing down on him. "Not because of who you are," he said, struggling to find the right words. "But because of how I acted." Keanu nodded slowly, as if considering this. Then he smiled, the same easy, genuine smile he had worn throughout the entire flight. "I appreciate that." Carl let out another quiet laugh, this time at himself. "Man. I really messed this up, didn't I?" Keanu chuckled lightly. "We all have our moments." The conversation between them had ended, but the lesson lingered. Carl sank into his seat, silent for the first time since takeoff. He had always believed that power came from how others perceived you. That respect was something you demanded. But Keanu Reeves had just proven him wrong without even trying. And for the first time in years, Carl wasn't sure if he liked the person he had been. The hum of the airplane engines filled the cabin as the flight continued in an almost surreal silence. Carl Harding sat stiffly in his seat, reeling from the revelation that had just shattered his perception of the man beside him. Keanu Reeves. The Keanu Reeves. Carl had spent the past hour trying to size him up, condescend to him, subtly push him into proving his worth. And yet, the only one who had been tested was Carl himself. And he had failed. The worst part wasn't even the embarrassment. It wasn't the growing murmurs among the other passengers, the quiet smirks from those who had been listening, or the disapproving glances from the woman across the aisle. No, the worst part was the simple fact that Keanu had never once stooped to his level. Carl let out a slow breath, his fingers absently twisting his wedding ring. He had spent years cultivating an image of himself, powerful, successful, respected. But what had it all amounted to if a single plane ride with a man in a plaid shirt could make him question everything? He shifted uncomfortably, then turned slightly toward Keanu, who was flipping through a book as if nothing had happened. Carl cleared his throat. Look, he ran a hand through his neatly styled hair, suddenly feeling like a schoolboy being scolded by his teacher. I need to say I'm sorry. Keanu turned to him, raising a polite eyebrow. For what? Carl exhaled. For the way I acted. For assuming things about you. He shook his head, still grappling with his own thoughts. I spent the whole flight trying to, I don't even know. Prove something, I guess. Keanu studied him for a moment before giving a small nod. I appreciate the apology. That was it. No condescending smirk, no victorious gloating. Just calm acceptance. Carl shifted again, his pride still resisting the weight of humility. It's just. I've worked my whole life for this, he said, gesturing vaguely at the first-class cabin. For success, for respect. And then he let out a weak chuckle, you just sit here, being yourself, and somehow you have more of it than I ever will. Keanu smiled slightly, setting his book down. Respect isn't about what you have, Carl. It's about how you treat people. Carl swallowed, feeling the truth of those words settle deep in his chest. Keanu continued, his voice quiet but firm. I've met people with nothing who had more dignity than billionaires. And I've met powerful men who were empty inside. Status doesn't define character. Choices do. Carl nodded slowly, staring down at his hands. Choices. For years, he had lived as if the world owed him admiration because of what he had built, what he had achieved. But Keanu Reeves, someone with more fame and success than Carl could ever dream of, walked through the world without demanding anything. And somehow, he commanded more respect than Carl had ever managed. Carl let out a breath, rubbing his temples. Man, I feel like an idiot. Keanu chuckled. You're not an idiot. You're just learning. Carl looked up at him, searching his face for any sign of mockery. But there was none. Just patience. Just kindness. The overhead speakers chimed, and the pilot's voice came through. Ladies and gentlemen, we'll be landing shortly. Please return to your seats and fasten your seatbelts. Carl swallowed the lump in his throat. The flight was almost over, but something told him this lesson would stay with him long after he stepped off the plane. As the cabin bustled with movement, flight attendants making final checks, passengers gathering their belongings, Carl sat motionless, lost in thought. When the plane touched down, Keanu stood, stretching slightly before reaching for his old backpack. Carl watched him, still stunned at how effortlessly the man carried himself, as if completely untouched by the world's expectations. As Keanu slung the backpack over his shoulder, Carl found himself speaking before he even knew what he was going to say. Hey, Keanu. Keanu turned back to him, his expression open and expectant. Carl hesitated, then simply extended his hand. It was interesting flying with you. Keanu smiled and shook his hand firmly. Likewise, Carl. Carl felt an odd sense of relief at the handshake, as if some invisible weight had lifted just a little. As Keanu stepped into the aisle, a few passengers watched him with quiet admiration. Some discreetly snapped photos, while others simply nodded in respect. Carl saw it all. And for the first time, he understood. Keanu hadn't demanded respect. He had earned it. Not with money. Not with power. But with humility. Carl sat back as the other passengers began filing out of the plane, his mind still reeling. The person who had walked onto that plane hours ago was not the same man sitting here now. And maybe, that was a good thing. As Keanu disappeared into the crowd, Carl exhaled and reached into his jacket pocket, pulling out his phone. He stared at the reflection of himself in the dark screen for a long moment. Then, for the first time in years, he found himself wondering. Who am I when no one is watching? And for the first time, he wasn't sure he liked the answer. But maybe, just maybe, there was still time to change.